Don't tell the others, Hyung, please. Jungkook's voice broke so suddenly that Jimin stopped breathing, his hand still trembling against Jungkook's shoulder as the muffled roar of thousands of fans shook the walls of the backstage corridor. The room smelled of hairspray, warm stage lights, sweat, and the faint metallic scent of equipment that had been running for hours, but none of it seemed real anymore. Jungkook sat on the floor behind a black equipment curtain, his stage jacket half open, his in-ear monitor hanging loosely around his neck, tears sliding silently down his cheeks as he stared at the concrete beneath him. Jimin was crouched beside him, one hand pressed carefully against his back. Jungkook, Jimin whispered, look at me. Jungkook shook his head. I can't. You can. No, Jung. I really can't. His fingers curled tightly into the fabric of his pants. Jimin had seen Jungkook exhausted before. He had seen him injured, frustrated, embarrassed, angry, and overwhelmed. But this was different. There was no dramatic sobbing, no raised voice, no visible panic. That frightened Jimin more than anything. Jungkook was crying quietly, as if he had spent the entire night trying desperately not to let anyone hear him. Somewhere beyond the curtain, stage managers shouted countdowns while dancers hurried past with towels and water bottles. A bass line from the main stage vibrated through the floor. The concert was still happening. Thousands of people were chanting their names. Yet behind that curtain, Jungkook looked like the entire world had suddenly become too heavy for him to carry. Jimin lowered himself onto the floor beside him. Tell me what happened. Nothing. Jungkook. I said nothing. Jimin watched him carefully. You always say nothing when something hurts. Jungkook swallowed hard. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he whispered, I thought I was ready. Jimin's expression softened. Ready for what? Jungkook finally looked at him. His eyes were red, wet, and frightened. For everyone to expect me to be okay. The words hit Jimin harder than any scream could have. Before Jimin could answer, footsteps suddenly approached from the other side of the curtain. Slow footsteps. Familiar footsteps. Jimin's head snapped toward the entrance. The curtain moved. Suga stepped inside. He had been looking for one of the staff members when he noticed the unusual silence behind the equipment area. And he stopped the instant he saw them. Jungkook on the floor. Jimin beside him. Tears on Jungkook's face. For one long second, nobody moved. The distant sound of the audience seemed to disappear. Suga's eyes moved from Jungkook's face to Jimin's hand resting on his back. His expression changed immediately. Not anger. Not surprise. Something much deeper. Concern. What happened? Suga asked quietly. Jimin opened his mouth, but Jungkook spoke first. Hyung, his voice cracked. Suga walked closer. Why are you crying? Jungkook wiped his face quickly, almost embarrassed to be seen. I've fine. Suga stopped directly in front of him. Don't lie to me. Jungkook looked away. Suga crouched down. The usual calmness in his face had disappeared. Look at me. Jungkook hesitated. Then he slowly raised his eyes. Suga stared at him for several seconds before asking, who made you feel like you had to hide this? Jungkook's lips trembled. Nobody. That's not what I asked. Jimin lowered his gaze. He knew Suga had noticed something. Suga had always been frighteningly observant. He could recognize exhaustion in the smallest movement, sadness behind a smile, and fear hidden inside a joke. Jungkook took a shaky breath. He stopped. I heard something. Suga's eyes narrowed. What did you hear? Jungkook pressed his palms together. Someone said I was becoming a burden. Silence filled the room. Jimin's face changed instantly. Suga's jaw tightened. Ooh. Jungkook shook his head. I don't know. You don't know? I was walking past the production room. I heard voices inside. They were talking about the schedule and the performance, and then I heard my name. His voice became quieter. They said everyone had to keep adjusting because of me. Jimin immediately understood why Jungkook had broken down. You believe them? I don't know. Jungkook looked down. Maybe they're right. Suga's expression hardened. No, the single word was so firm that Jungkook looked up. Suga leaned closer. You are not a burden. Jungkook's eyes filled again. But Hyung. No, Suga interrupted him. You don't get to decide that your existence is an inconvenience just because someone said something cruel. Jimin's eyes became glossy. Jungkook looked between them, struggling to hold himself together. I'm tired, he whispered. I'm so tired of trying to prove that I deserve to stand on that stage. Suga stared at him, and something inside his expression seemed to break. He reached forward and placed one hand on Jungkook's shoulder. You never had to prove that to us. Jungkook's tears fell again. Then why does it feel like I do? Nobody answered immediately. Outside, the crowd erupted into another deafening cheer. The sound rolled through the building like thunder. Jungkook flinched. Suga noticed. Jimin noticed too. How long have you been feeling like this? Suga asked. Jungkook shrugged. A while. How long? Weeks. Jimin closed his eyes for a moment. Weeks. Jungkook had been smiling beside them for weeks, while carrying something none of them had seen. Suga stood and looked toward the curtain. His eyes became cold. Stay here. Jungkook immediately grabbed his wrist. No. Suga looked down. No what? Please don't confront anyone. Why? Because I don't want everyone fighting because of me. Suga stared at him. Then his expression softened again. You still don't understand. He crouched down once more. This isn't about fighting for you. This is about making sure you never have to sit alone in a dark corner and cry because you think you're unwanted. Jimin reached for Jungkook's hand. He's right. Jungkook looked at both of them. For the first time that night, his shoulders began to relax. But before the moment could settle, another sound came from the hallway. A metal case slammed against the wall. Someone hurried past. A staff member called out, "Where is Jungkook?" Jungkook froze. Suga immediately stood. Jimin rose beside him. They're looking for you, Jimin whispered. Jungkook's face went pale. I can't go back out there. You don't have to, Jimin said. Not until you're ready. Suga looked toward the corridor. Who is asking? The staff member appeared at the curtain. Suga Hyung, there you are. We've been searching everywhere. Jungkook needs to be ready for the next segment. Suga's eyes moved briefly toward Jungkook, then back to the staff member. He needs 5 minutes. But the schedule, 5 minutes. The staff member hesitated. There was something in Suga's voice that made the argument disappear before it started. Okay. The curtain closed again. Jungkook stared at Suga. Thank you. Suga shrugged. 5 minutes. Jimin smiled faintly. You mean 10? Suga gave him a look. 7. For the first time, Jungkook almost smiled. It was tiny, fragile, but real. Yet none of them knew that the person who had spoken those cruel words was not a random staff member, and that the misunderstanding was only the surface of something much larger. Earlier that evening, before Jungkook had entered the production corridor, an envelope had been left inside his dressing room. No name. No explanation. Just a single photograph and a handwritten sentence. You should know what they say when you're not around. Jungkook had opened it alone. The photograph showed several pages of printed messages, some containing harsh criticism about the group's schedule, others questioning Jungkook's condition and performance. But one line had been highlighted in red. If he can't keep up, the others will have to carry him. Jungkook had stared at that sentence for nearly a minute before folding the papers and hiding them inside his jacket. He had not shown Jimin. He had not shown Suga. He had not shown anyone. He had convinced himself that protecting the others from worry was more important than protecting himself. Now, sitting between Jimin and Suga, he finally understood how badly that decision had failed. Jimin noticed the edge of the photograph sticking out from Jungkook's jacket. What's that? Jungkook froze. Suga noticed too. Jungkook. Slowly, Jungkook pulled out the folded papers. Jimin took them carefully. He opened the first page. His face changed. Suga leaned over his shoulder. The room became silent again. There were printed screenshots, fragments of conversations, anonymous comments, and notes describing rehearsal difficulties. Some were ordinary criticism. Others were cruel. But what disturbed Suga most was the date at the bottom of the page. It was from 3 weeks earlier. Why didn't you tell us? Jimin asked. Jungkook looked down. Because I thought I could handle it. The moment Jungkook stepped off the stage, he barely made it 3 steps before his knees weakened, and Jimin caught him by the arm as Suga immediately pushed through the cluster of staff surrounding them, his usually calm eyes now carrying a seriousness that made everyone instinctively move aside. "Give him space," Suga said. Nobody argued. The corridor that had been filled with shouting technicians and rushing dancers suddenly became strangely quiet, as if everyone could sense that something had changed. Jungkook leaned against the wall, breathing hard, sweat cooling against his skin while the distant applause still thundered through the stadium. "I'm okay," he whispered. Jimin shook his head. "Stop saying that." Suga approached slowly. "How did you feel out there?" Jungkook stared at the floor. "Like everyone could see through me." Suga studied his face. "Maybe that's because you stopped pretending." Jungkook looked up. For a moment, none of them spoke. Then a stage assistant appeared holding a bottle of water. "Jungkook, the next segment starts in 12 minutes. Suga turned toward him. "He needs a break." "But the schedule." "I said he needs a break." The assistant nodded and disappeared. Jimin helped Jungkook into a chair. "Drink." Jungkook obeyed, taking small sips while his hands trembled around the bottle. Suga stood nearby with the folded papers still hidden inside his jacket. He had not told Jungkook what he had noticed. There was something wrong with the documents. The screenshots were real, but several timestamps had been altered. Whoever assembled them had mixed genuine information with carefully selected fragments designed to make Jungkook feel unwanted. It wasn't random cruelty. It was manipulation. "Young," Jungkook said quietly. Are you angry?" Suga looked at him. "At you? Never." "At whoever did this?" Suga's expression hardened. "Yes." Jimin sat beside Jungkook. "But we're not going to jump to conclusions." Suga nodded. "Exactly." He pulled out the pages. "We're going to find facts." Jungkook stared at the documents. What if the person is someone we trust? The question hung in the air. Jimin slowly looked toward the hallway. Suga didn't answer immediately. "Then we'll deal with the truth when we know it." Jungkook's fingers tightened around the bottle. "I don't want anyone fighting because of me." "This isn't because of you," Suga replied. "Someone chose to do this. That's on them." Suddenly, a loud crash came from the dressing room corridor. Everyone turned. A production cart had overturned. Several metal cases rolled across the floor. Staff rushed toward the noise. Suga instinctively moved in front of Jungkook. Jimin stood too. "Stay here," Suga said. "What happened?" Jimin asked. A staff member shouted from down the corridor. "Someone knocked over the equipment." Suga walked toward the scene. He stopped when he noticed something beneath one of the cases. A small black envelope. He bent down and picked it up. There was no name on it. Only 3 words written across the front. "For Jungkook only." Suga's face changed. He looked back at Jungkook. Jungkook saw the envelope and immediately went pale. "That's the same handwriting," he whispered. Jimin stood. "You're sure?" Jungkook nodded. Suga returned and handed him the envelope. "Open it here." Jungkook hesitated. His thumb shook as he broke the seal. Inside was a single piece of paper. No photograph this time. No screenshots. Just one sentence. "You are looking in the wrong place." Jungkook stared at it. Jimin frowned. "What does that mean?" Suga took the paper and turned it over. Nothing. He held it beneath the backstage light. Nothing. Then he noticed a faint indentation in the paper. Someone had written something on another sheet while pressing hard enough to leave marks. Suga grabbed a pencil from a nearby table and shaded the surface gently. Letters slowly appeared. "Ask Jimin what he did after Tuesday's rehearsal." Jungkook looked at Jimin. Jimin froze. "What?" Jungkook's voice was barely audible. "What did you do after rehearsal?" Jimin stared at the message. "Nothing." Suga watched him carefully. "Think." Jimin's breathing became uneven. "I went back to my room." Jungkook didn't look away. "Are you sure?" Jimin closed his eyes. A memory surfaced. Tuesday night. The rehearsal had ended late. Most of the staff had already left. Jimin remembered walking down the hallway and hearing music coming from Studio B. He had opened the door and found someone inside. Someone he hadn't expected. He remembered a conversation. He remembered being told not to tell Jungkook. But he couldn't remember why. Jimin. Jungkook whispered. Jimin opened his eyes. There was someone in Studio B. Suga's expression sharpened. Who? Jimin swallowed. I don't know. You saw their face? No. They were standing with their back to me. Jungkook looked confused. Why didn't you tell me? Jimin lowered his head. Because they asked me not to. Who? I don't know. What did they say? Jimin's voice became quieter. They said something had happened involving you. Jungkook stared at him. What happened? Jimin shook his head. I don't know. That's the truth. Suga stepped closer. What else? Jimin hesitated. They said if I told you you'd leave. Jungkook's face drained of color. Leave? Jimin nodded slowly. That's all I remember. Suga looked from one to the other. The mystery was becoming more disturbing with every answer. Someone had apparently known exactly which fears to target. They had convinced Jungkook that the others saw him as a burden. They had convinced Jimin that telling Jungkook something would make him leave. And now they were leaving clues designed to turn the members against one another. This is deliberate, Suga said. Jimin looked at him. You think they're trying to break us apart? I think someone wants us to believe we're already broken. Jungkook lowered his eyes. Why? Suga didn't answer. Because he was thinking about the documents again. Someone had access to private schedules, backstage areas, rehearsal information, and conversations. Someone who understood how the group worked. Someone close enough to know exactly where to place the messages. A sudden announcement echoed through the corridor. 10 minutes to the next stage transition. Jimin stood. We need to go. Jungkook looked at Suga. What do we do? Suga folded the papers and placed them safely inside his pocket. We finish the show. And after? After, Suga said, we start asking questions. The three walked toward the stage entrance. But just before they reached it, Suga stopped. He noticed a security camera above the corridor. Its small red indicator light was off. Why isn't that camera recording? He asked. A nearby technician glanced upward. It should be. Suga stared at it. Should be isn't an answer. The technician checked the monitor. His expression changed. The feed went offline 26 minutes ago. Jimin looked at Suga. 26 minutes? Suga nodded. That was almost exactly when Jungkook had entered the corridor crying. Someone had known. Someone had made sure there would be no recording. Jungkook whispered, Hyung. Suga raised one hand. Don't say anything. He looked around the corridor. For the first time that night, his calm expression disappeared completely. We're being watched. Jimin's eyes widened. Jungkook instinctively moved closer to them. Then from somewhere behind the curtains, a phone vibrated. Once. Twice. 3 times. Everyone turned. A black smartphone lay on a production table. Nobody claimed it. Suga approached slowly. The screen lit up with a new message. Stop asking questions. Suga stared at the words. Then another message appeared. Or next time, Jungkook won't be the only one crying. The corridor fell completely silent. Jimin looked at Jungkook. Jungkook looked at Suga. Suga slowly picked up the phone, his eyes fixed on the screen, realizing that whoever had started this game was no longer hiding in the shadows. They were close enough to hear everything. And they had just made their first direct threat. Put the phone down, Jungkook, right now. Suga's voice cut through the backstage corridor with such sudden authority that even the technicians nearby stopped moving, while Jungkook stood frozen beside Jimin, staring at the anonymous message glowing on the screen. Stop asking questions. Or next time, Jungkook won't be the only one crying. For several seconds, nobody breathed. The stadium outside continued roaring, but backstage everything felt unnaturally still. Suga slowly placed the phone on the table, without touching another button. Nobody touches it, he said. Nobody calls anyone. Nobody leaves this corridor alone. Jimin nodded immediately. Jungkook swallowed. Hyung, what if they're watching us right now? Suga looked directly at him. Then let them watch. His voice was calm, But there was something dangerous underneath it. Because they made one mistake. Jungkook stared at him. What mistake? They threatened you in front of me. Jimin's expression tightened. Suga turned toward the security technician. I want the camera system checked. Not just the corridor feed. Every camera connected to this backstage network. The technician hurried away. A few staff members exchanged nervous glances. Suga noticed. He always noticed. Everyone stays where they are, he said. Nobody argued. Jimin moved closer to Jungkook. Are you scared? Jungkook tried to smile. A little. You don't have to hide it. Jungkook looked down. I keep thinking this is my fault. Jimin immediately shook his head. It isn't. But if I hadn't. No, Jimin interrupted gently. Don't finish that sentence. Jungkook looked at him. Someone chose to manipulate you. That choice belongs to them. Suga heard the conversation but said nothing. Instead, he examined the phone from a distance. The device looked ordinary. Black case. No identifying marks. The screen had already gone dark. Where did it come from? He asked. A stage assistant raised her hand hesitantly. I saw it on the table about 10 minutes ago. Was anyone standing here? Several people. Did you see who placed it? She shook her head. No Suga nadie. Okay. His calmness made the situation even more unsettling. Jimin knew that expression. Whenever Suga became that quiet, his mind was moving faster than anyone else's. Young, Jimin whispered. What are you thinking? Suga glanced at him. I'm thinking that whoever did this wants us emotional. Why? Because emotional people make mistakes. Jungkook looked at the phone. So we don't react. Exactly. Suga pulled a chair closer and sat down. We don't accuse anyone. We don't confront anyone. We don't tell the person we know more than they think we know. Jimin nodded. Then what? We observe. Jungkook took a slow breath. I can do that. Suga looked at him. No. You don't have to do anything. But, your job tonight is to get through the concert safely. Suga paused. Our job is everything else. The words made Jungkook's eyes water again. He quickly looked away. Jimin noticed and gently squeezed his hand. See? Jimin whispered. You're not carrying this alone anymore. A few minutes later, the security technician returned with a tablet. The corridor camera was manually disconnected. Suga looked up. Manually? Yes. From where? That's the strange part. The command came from an internal terminal. Suga stood. Which terminal? The technician hesitated. Production control. Jimin's expression changed. So someone inside the production area did it? Possibly, the technician replied. But the terminal is shared by several authorized staff members. Suga nodded. Then we don't have a suspect. He looked at Jungkook. We have access. That distinction mattered. Someone didn't necessarily have to be a member of the group, or even someone personally close to them. They only needed enough access to manipulate information. But then another possibility occurred to Suga. Show me the access log. The technician opened the file. Lines of timestamps appeared across the screen. Suga studied them carefully. The camera had gone offline at 10:17 p.m. The first anonymous message had been sent at 10:21. The second at 10:44. Suga frowned. Wait. He pointed to the screen. Why is this timestamp different? The technician leaned closer. What do you mean? The terminal says the camera was disconnected at 10:17, but the backup system logged the disconnection at 10:19. That's impossible. Exactly. Suga looked at Jimin. Someone altered the records. Jungkook stared at the screen. So even the security system can't tell us the truth. Not yet, Suga replied. But it can tell us something else. He pointed to a line beneath the access record. This terminal was unlocked using a temporary authorization code. The technician looked confused. Only management can generate those. Suga's expression became colder. Then we need to know who generated it. Before anyone could answer, a voice came from behind them. I can check. Everyone turned. Mr. Lee, one of the senior backstage coordinators, approached with a tablet in his hand. He had been overseeing the stage transitions all evening and looked exhausted. I heard there was a problem. Suga studied him. There is. Mr. Lee looked at Jungkook. Is he okay? Jungkook nodded automatically. Ai fine. Suga immediately said, he's not. Mr. Lee looked surprised. Jimin lowered his gaze. Suga continued, someone has been sending him anonymous messages. Mr. Lee's expression changed. What kind of messages? Suga showed him the screen. Mr. Lee read it. His face tightened. That's serious. Can you tell us who accessed the production terminal? Suga asked. Mr. Lee nodded. I can try. He opened the authorization system. After several seconds, he stopped. That's strange. Suga stepped closer. What? The code was issued under my credentials. Jimin's eyes widened. Your credentials? Mr. Lee nodded slowly. But I didn't generate it. Suga stared at him. Could someone have copied your credentials? Possibly. Who has access? Mr. Lee hesitated. 3 people. Suga looked at him. Names. Mr. Lee listed them quietly. The head of production, the technical director, and the night operations supervisor. Suga memorized the names. Then he noticed something else. What time did you last use the terminal? Around 9:40. And after that? I was on stage left. Anyone with you? Several staff members. Jimin looked at Suga. That gives us 3 possibilities. Suga shook his head. No. It gives us 3 people who could be framed. Jimin paused. You're right. Suga looked at Jungkook. That's what they want. Jungkook finally understood. They want us to accuse someone innocent. Exactly. The anonymous messages weren't simply trying to frighten them. They were designed to create suspicion. If the members started accusing staff, the backstage team would become divided. If they accused one another, the group itself would fracture. Whoever was behind this understood human behavior frighteningly well. They knew fear could be more destructive than any physical threat. Suddenly Jungkook remembered something. Young. Suga turned. What? The envelope. What about it? Jungkook reached inside his jacket and pulled out the first envelope. There was something on the back. Jimin leaned closer. You never mentioned that. I didn't notice it before. Jungkook turned the envelope under the light. A faint logo appeared beneath the black ink. Mr. Lee immediately recognized it. That's from the old rehearsal archive. Suga looked at him. What archive? Storage room B17. It's where we keep old production materials. Jimin frowned. Why would someone use an old archive envelope? Mr. Lee shook his head. I don't know. Suga looked toward the corridor. Where is B17? 2 floors below us. Is it still accessible? Technically, yes. Suga turned to Jimin. Stay with Jungkook. Jimin nodded. Where are you going? To look at the archive. Jungkook immediately stood. I'm coming. Suga shook his head. No, but it's about me. That's exactly why you're staying here. Jungkook's expression tightened. I don't want everyone protecting me like I'm helpless. Suga looked at him for a long moment. I'm not protecting you because you're helpless. He lowered his voice. I'm protecting you because someone has decided you're the easiest person to hurt. Jungkook became silent. Suga placed a hand briefly on his shoulder. Let me carry the... By the time the final stage lights dimmed, Jungkook felt as though the entire night had happened inside a dream. Yet the weight of the black notebook in Suga's hands was painfully real, and as the last echoes of the audience faded into the distance, the 3 of them remained backstage beneath the harsh white fluorescent lights, surrounded by dismantled microphones, tangled cables, half-empty water bottles, and staff members who were slowly beginning to realize that something far more serious than an emotional breakdown had happened that night. Jungkook sat quietly on a folding chair while Jimin stood behind him, gently rubbing his shoulders, and Suga remained at the table, turning the pages of the notebook one by one. Every page contained fragments of their lives. Rehearsal times, travel schedules, changes to entrances, Notes about who arrived early and who stayed late. Even tiny observations such as which member usually left the dressing room alone. It was the kind of information nobody should have been collecting without permission. How long has this been happening? Jimin asked. Suga didn't immediately answer. At least 6 months. Jungkook looked up sharply. 6 months. Suga nodded. Some entries go back even further. Jungkook stared at the notebook. But why? Suga closed it gently. That's what we're trying to understand. Mr. Lee stood nearby, his arms folded tightly across his chest. He had stopped looking like a tired coordinator and started looking like someone personally offended by the breach of trust. I can secure the archive, he said. No one enters without authorization. Suga nodded. Do it quietly. Why quietly? Jimin asked. Suga looked at him. Because if the person behind this realizes we've found the notebook, they'll destroy whatever evidence remains. Jungkook's fingers tightened around his sleeve. So we pretend we know nothing? Not exactly. Suga looked toward him. We act normally. Jungkook gave a tired laugh. That's harder than it sounds. I know. Suga sat opposite him. But tonight you learned something important. Jungkook waited. You don't have to believe every terrible thing someone tells you about yourself. Jungkook looked down. I know. Do you? Suga asked gently. Jungkook remained silent. Jimin answered for him. He's learning. Suga nodded. That's enough. For a few seconds, the room was quiet. Then Jungkook spoke softly. Young, can I ask you something? Sure. When you first walked in and saw me crying, he hesitated. What did you think? Suga's eyes softened. I thought you were hurting. Nothing else. No Jungkook swallowed. You weren't disappointed? Suga almost looked offended by the question. Why would I be disappointed? Because I couldn't control myself. Suga leaned forward. Jungkook, listen to me. Tears don't disappoint me. Seeing you believe you had to hide them does. Jungkook's eyes immediately filled again. Jimin quietly handed him a tissue. Suga looked away for a moment, pretending to inspect the notebook, but Jimin noticed the subtle movement of his jaw. Suga was emotional too. He simply refused to show it. You know, Jimin said softly, he cried once because his favorite ramen wasn't available. Suga immediately looked at him. That story never happened. Jungkook laughed through his tears. It definitely happened. It was spicy ramen, Suga protested. You were devastated, Jimin said. You gave a 5-minute speech about injustice. Jungkook laughed harder, and suddenly the heavy atmosphere cracked. Even Mr. Lee smiled. For a brief moment, the anonymous messages, the hidden notebook, and the strange threats seemed far away. But Suga knew laughter did not erase danger. It only reminded them why they needed to protect one another. After everyone else had left the immediate area, Suga asked Mr. Lee to close the backstage doors. The corridor became quieter. The smell of smoke machines lingered in the air, mixed with sweat and the faint sweetness of energy drinks. Let's reconstruct tonight, Suga said. Minute by minute. Jimin nodded. Jungkook closed his eyes, trying to remember. I finished rehearsal at 8:40. Then, I went to my dressing room. Alone? Yes. What happened there? Jungkook hesitated. The envelope was on the table. Did you touch anything else? My phone. My jacket. A bottle of water. Did anyone enter? I don't remember. Suga looked at Jimin. What about you? I left rehearsal around 8:50. And Studio B? Jimin took a breath. I passed it around 9. You saw the person? Yes. And you didn't tell anyone? Jimin looked ashamed. I thought it was nothing. Suga's expression softened. You didn't know. I should have. No, Suga said firmly. Don't rewrite the past because you know more now. Jimin nodded slowly. Jungkook watched him. It's not your fault. Jimin looked at him. I know. There was a brief silence before Suga asked. What happened after Studio B? I went to my room. I received a message. From whom? Unknown number. What did it say? Jimin closed his eyes. It said, don't tell Jungkook what you saw. Jungkook stared at him. Why didn't you tell me anyway? Jimin looked directly at him. Because the next message said, if you do, he will leave. Jungkook's face tightened. Leave the group. That's what I assumed. Suga rubbed his forehead. They knew exactly which fear to use. Jungkook whispered. Mine was being a burden. Yours was losing me. Jimin nodded. And Suga's? They both looked at him. Suga gave a faint smile. Probably anger. Jimin laughed quietly. Definitely anger. Suga shook his head. They're not wrong. Jungkook smiled. Young. Suga's expression softened. But there's another possibility. What? Jimin asked. Maybe the person behind this isn't trying to destroy us. Jungkook frowned. Then what are they trying to do? Maybe they're trying to force us to notice something. The room became silent. Jimin looked at the notebook. You think the messages are clues? Some of them might be. Suga pointed to the pages. The person wants us to discover the notebook. They deliberately left it somewhere we could find it. Why would they threaten us then? Jungkook asked. Because they don't want us to know they're helping us. Jimin looked confused. That's ridiculous. Maybe. Suga nodded toward the final page. But look at the wording. They will never know who I am. It doesn't say, they will never find me. Jimin stared at the sentence. You're right. Jungkook slowly understood. Maybe they want us to keep searching. Exactly. Suga closed the notebook. Which means the threats might be part of the message. But why scare me? Jungkook asked. Suga looked at him. Because fear makes you pay attention. Jungkook looked uncomfortable. That's not fair. No, Suga agreed. It isn't. He stood. Which is why we won't excuse it. They spent the next hour examining every page. Some information was mundane. Some was disturbing. But one pattern began to emerge. Every time something important happened within the group, a new entry appeared in the notebook. A difficult rehearsal. A disagreement. A sudden schedule change. A moment when one member seemed emotionally exhausted. The writer had been observing them closely, but not always negatively. Some notes were strangely protective. One page contained a warning about a faulty stage mechanism. Another mentioned that Jungkook had been skipping meals during rehearsals. Another warned that Jimin's schedule had been overloaded. This doesn't look like someone trying to hurt us, Jimin whispered. Not entirely, Suga said. Jungkook touched the page. Maybe they're trying to protect us in a strange way. Or manipulate us into depending on them, Suga replied. The possibility silenced everyone. The difference between protection and control could be almost invisible. Suga knew that better than anyone. We can't trust the notebook, he said. But we can't ignore it either. Mr. Lee returned with new information. The archive door was accessed twice this month. Suga looked up. By whom? The system doesn't show a name. Again? Again. Suga sighed. Then the system has been compromised longer than we thought. Mr. Lee placed another document on the table. But I found something unusual. Suga opened it. What? A maintenance request from 3 months ago. Someone reported that the archive camera was malfunctioning. Who filed it? An anonymous staff account. Jimin frowned. Yes. Suga read the request carefully. It said that the camera was producing corrupted footage. The maintenance team never repaired it because the request was marked low priority. Suga stared at the date. 3 months ago. Yes. And that, the first thing Jungkook noticed when he returned to the backstage room was the silence, because the room that had been filled with voices only minutes earlier was now completely empty except for one small light above the mirror, and a folded black envelope sitting precisely in the center of his chair. He stopped walking. Jimin, who had been following directly behind him, almost collided with his shoulder. What's wrong? Jungkook didn't answer. He simply pointed. Suga immediately stepped between them and the chair. Nobody touches it. The envelope looked almost identical to the one Jungkook had received earlier, except this time there was a tiny silver mark pressed into the corner. A ring. The same symbol they had found in the notebook. Suga stared at it for several seconds. Everyone out. Mr. Lee immediately understood. You want the room cleared? Yes. Within seconds, the remaining staff members moved away, leaving only Suga, Jimin, Jungkook, and Mr. Lee near the doorway. The air conditioner hummed softly overhead. Somewhere outside, a cleaning cart squeaked across the hallway. Jungkook stared at the envelope. Why would they leave it here? Suga answered without looking away. Because they knew we'd come back. Jimin's voice became quiet. Then they knew where we were. Suga nodded. Which means they have access to the schedule. Jungkook's stomach tightened. Or they're watching us. Suga looked at him. Don't assume that yet. He approached the envelope carefully, wearing gloves Mr. Lee had brought from the security office. He turned it over. Nothing. No name. No address. No writing. He placed it inside a transparent evidence sleeve. We're not opening this here. Jungkook frowned. But what if there's something important? There probably is. Suga looked at him. That's why we're not opening it carelessly. They moved to a secured meeting room 2 corridors away. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. A single overhead lamp illuminated the table. Suga placed the envelope in the middle. Jimin sat beside Jungkook. Mr. Lee stood near the door. Ready? Suga asked. Jungkook nodded. Suga opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a photograph. Jungkook immediately recognized the place. It was the backstage hallway from several weeks earlier. In the photograph, Jungkook was standing alone looking down at his phone. The timestamp showed 2:13 a.m. Jimin leaned closer. You were there? Jungkook stared at the picture. Yes. Suga looked at him. What happened that night? Jungkook thought. I couldn't sleep. I came back to the studio. Alone? Yes. Did you see anyone? No. Suga turned the photograph over. There was a sentence written in black ink. He wasn't alone. Jungkook's face went pale. But I was. Jimin studied the photograph. Maybe someone was nearby. Suga nodded. Or maybe this is meant to make us think someone was. Beneath the photograph was another smaller piece of paper. It contained a list of dates. Every date corresponded to a moment when Jungkook had experienced emotional exhaustion. A difficult rehearsal. A missed meal. A sleepless night. A private conversation. A moment when he had cried. Jimin stared at the list. They're documenting his emotional state. Suga's expression hardened. Yes. Jungkook's hands began to tremble. Why me? Nobody answered. He looked at the photograph again. Why have they been watching me? Suga reached across the table. Don't turn this into your fault. Jungkook swallowed. It's hard not to. Jimin immediately took his hand. Then let us stop you. Jungkook looked at him. How? Every time you start blaming yourself, we'll remind you of the facts. Suga nodded. Facts first. Feelings second. Jungkook smiled faintly. That's very Suga. It works. Then Suga noticed something in the photograph. He leaned closer. In the far corner of the hallway, barely visible behind a door, was a reflection in a glass panel. A person's hand. A silver ring with a black stone. Suga's eyes narrowed. There. Jimin leaned closer. The ring. Mr. Lee stepped forward. Can you enhance it? We can try. They took the image to the security office. A technician enlarged the photograph on a monitor. The reflection became clearer. The person was standing several meters behind Jungkook. Their face remained hidden, but the ring was unmistakable. Can you identify the ring? Suga asked. The technician shook his head. No. What about the reflection? We might be able to identify clothing. They enhanced the image again. A dark jacket. A black cap. A lanyard around the neck. Mr. Lee frowned. That lanyard looks familiar. Suga looked at him. From where? Production management. Jimin's eyes widened. So it's someone with access. Mr. Lee nodded slowly. Possibly. Suga didn't react. Don't tell anyone. Why? Because if we have a suspect, even an incomplete one, we don't let them know. Mr. Lee understood. I'll keep it confidential. Jungkook watched the screen. The person in the photograph seemed almost unreal. A shadow behind him. a silent observer. He suddenly remembered the night, the empty hallway, the cold air, his own footsteps. He remembered feeling as if someone had been watching him. At the time, he had dismissed it as exhaustion. Now he wasn't sure. Hyung, he said quietly. I remember something. Suga turned. What? That night, I heard footsteps. Jimin looked at him. Behind you? Yes. How many? 2 sets. Everyone went silent. 2 people. Suga asked. Jungkook nodded. One was walking slowly. The other stopped. Did you turn around? No, why? Jungkook looked down. Because I was scared. Suga's expression softened. What happened after that? The footsteps stopped. Then, I heard a door close. Jimin whispered, which door? Jungkook pointed toward the security map. The old rehearsal archive. Suga stared at the map. B-17. Mr. Lee nodded. Exactly. The same archive where they had found the notebook. Suddenly, the pieces began to connect. Someone had been near Jungkook that night. Someone had entered the archive. Someone had been documenting their movements. But there was still one question. Who was the second person? Jimin asked. Jungkook shook his head. I don't know. Suga looked at the photograph again. Then we find out. Before they could investigate further, a security alarm sounded. Everyone turned toward the monitor. One of the archive doors had opened. Mr. Lee checked the system. B-17. Suga stood immediately. When? Just now. Jimin looked at Jungkook. Who has access? Mr. Lee shook his head. Only authorized personnel. Suga grabbed his jacket. We're going. Jungkook stood too. I'm coming. No, Hyung. You stay here. Jungkook's expression tightened. I'm tired of staying behind. Suga stopped. He looked at Jungkook for several seconds. Then he nodded. Fine. But you stay between us. Jimin smiled faintly. Deal. They moved quickly through the corridor. The building was almost empty now. The bright stage lights had been turned off, leaving only dim emergency lighting along the walls. Their footsteps echoed. The farther they walked, the colder the air became. When they reached the archive corridor, the door was slightly open. Suga raised one hand. Everyone stopped. He listened. Nothing. He pushed the door open. The room was dark. Old equipment lined the walls. Cardboard boxes filled the shelves. Dust floated through the narrow beam of light from the hallway. Hello? Jimin called. No answer. Suga entered first. Mr. Lee followed. Jungkook stayed between them. Then they heard something. A soft scraping sound from the back of the room. Suga turned toward it. Who's there? Silence. Then a box fell from a shelf. Jungkook flinched. Jimin grabbed his arm. Suga moved toward the sound. Behind the shelves was a narrow passage. At the end was another door. Mr. Lee stared at it. That door shouldn't be open. Suga touched the handle. It was cold. He slowly pushed it open. Behind it was a small monitoring room. Several old screens covered the wall. Most were turned off. One screen was still glowing. It showed a live feed from the backstage corridor. Jungkook's blood ran cold. That's us. On the screen, they could see themselves standing in the archive. Someone had been watching them in real time. Jimin whispered, they're here. Suga looked around the room. Maybe. Suddenly the screen changed. A video began playing. It showed Jungkook sitting alone in his dressing room weeks earlier. Then another video. Jimin walking. I promised someone I would never tell you what happened that night, Suga said. His voice barely rising above the hum of the old monitoring equipment. And the words seemed to drain every bit of warmth from the archive room. Jungkook stared at him, unable to understand how a secret from years ago could possibly be connected to the anonymous messages, the hidden notebook, and the footage of him crying backstage. Jimin stood completely still beside him. What night? He asked. Suga looked at the floor for several seconds before answering. A night when none of you knew how close we came to losing something important. Jungkook's throat tightened. Losing what? Suga slowly turned toward him. Trust. The word sounded strangely heavy. He walked toward an old chair and sat down, rubbing his hands together, as if trying to organize memories he had spent years refusing to touch. Before any of this happened, Suga began, there was a period when someone close to our work was struggling. They believed nobody was listening to them. They believed they had been forgotten. Jimin listened carefully. Who? Suga shook his head. I can't give you a name yet. Jungkook looked frustrated. Why not? Because I don't know whether the person we're dealing with now is the same person. But they know about your promise. Yes. Suga looked toward the monitor. And that means either they were there, they heard about it, or they've been digging through information that was never supposed to be public. Jimin stepped closer. What exactly did you promise? Suga inhaled slowly. I promised that if something happened to them, I would protect a certain truth. Jungkook frowned. What truth? That they had asked for help before anyone noticed. The sentence landed quietly. There was no dramatic sound, no sudden movement. Yet Jungkook felt something inside him shift. Suga wasn't talking about an ordinary secret. He was talking about someone who had once been vulnerable and had reached out to him. Did you help them? Jungkook asked. Suga looked away. I tried. Did it work? For a while. Jimin's expression softened. And then, Suga's eyes became distant. They disappeared from our lives. Silence. Jungkook stared at him. Disappeared. They left the company. Changed their number. Moved away. Nobody knew where they went. Jimin asked quietly. And you kept the promise? Yes. Why? Suga looked at him. Because sometimes people trust you with the worst moment of their life, and the only thing you can give them is silence. Jungkook understood the meaning, but something still bothered him. Then why would they come back like this? Suga shook his head. I don't know. Suddenly, the monitor flickered. The old footage disappeared. A new image appeared. A close-up of a handwritten page. The writing was familiar. It was the same handwriting as the messages. Beneath it was a sentence. He didn't break his promise. You broke yours. Jungkook stared at the screen. Whose promise? Suga's face hardened. Meaning. Jimin looked at him. What did you promise? Suga didn't answer. Instead, he stood and walked toward the monitoring console. He examined the cables, the switches, and the old recording system. This room has been modified. Mr. Lee looked around. How? Someone connected a modern network to an old system. Suga pointed to a small device hidden behind the console. This is how they're accessing the cameras. Mr. Lee leaned closer. Can we trace it? Maybe. He unplugged the device carefully. But if we cut the connection, we might lose whatever evidence they're sending. Jimin looked at the screen. Then don't disconnect it yet. Suga paused. You're right. He reconnected it. The monitor flickered again. This time there was no footage. Only a black screen with a white line of text. You have 10 minutes. Jungkook frowned. For what? Another sentence appeared. Find the red box. Jimin looked around. What red box? The screen displayed a map of the archive. One section was marked with a small red dot. Suga stared at it. There's a storage cabinet there. Mr. Lee nodded. Old records. They moved toward it. The cabinet was covered with dust. Suga opened the doors. Old folders fell forward. Nothing read. Maybe underneath, Jimin said. They searched through the shelves. Jungkook moved carefully through the papers. Then he noticed something behind a stack of old rehearsal programs. A corner of red cardboard. There. He pulled it out. It was a small red box. Suga immediately stopped him. Don't open it. Jungkook froze. Why? Because this is exactly what they want. Jimin looked at the box. Then what do we do? Suga examined the lock. We document it first. He photographed every side. The box was old, scratched, and slightly burned on one corner. There was no name. Only a tiny silver ring symbol. It's the same mark, Jungkook whispered. Suga nodded. Open it. Jimin looked surprised. You just said. We're already involved. Suga carefully opened the lid. Inside was a stack of photographs, an old USB drive, and a folded letter. Jungkook stared at the photographs. They showed rehearsals from years ago. Some included members. Others showed staff members they barely remembered. Then Jungkook saw one photograph that made his breath stop. It showed Suga standing outside a studio with another person. The person's face had been scratched out with black ink. Jimin looked at Suga. "Who is that?" Suga stared at the photograph. "Someone I failed." Jungkook's chest tightened. "You didn't fail them." Suga looked at him. "You don't know that." "Then tell us." Suga's expression became exhausted. "That's what I'm trying to do." He picked up the letter. The envelope was addressed simply, Teo Yoongi. His fingers tightened around it. Jimin noticed. "You never opened it?" Suga shook his head. "No, why?" "Because I was afraid of what it would say." Jungkook whispered. "And now?" Suga looked at the letter. "Now I'm more afraid of not knowing." He opened it. The paper was yellowed with age. The handwriting was the same as the anonymous messages. Suga read silently. His face changed with every line. Jimin watched him. "What does it say?" Suga lowered the letter. "It says they knew." "Knew what?" "That I kept the promise." Jungkook looked confused. "Then why are they angry?" Suga read one sentence aloud. "You promised to protect me, but you never promised to protect yourself." Jimin's eyes widened. Suga continued reading. The letter explained that the person had been struggling with pressure, isolation, and fear years earlier. They had asked Suga for help but refused to let him expose their private situation. Suga had agreed to keep their identity secret. Eventually, the person disappeared from the group's orbit. But they had left behind one request. "If I ever come back, don't save me by hiding the truth." Suga lowered the paper. His eyes were wet. Jungkook had never seen him like that. "Hyung," Suga looked away. "I thought I was protecting them." Jimin spoke softly. "Maybe you were." No, Suga shook his head. "I was protecting myself from the guilt of not knowing what else to do." Jungkook stepped closer. "You were young too." Suga laughed quietly, bitterly. "That doesn't make it easier." The USB drive lay beside the letter. Mr. Lee asked, "Should we check it?" Suga nodded. They connected it to the secure computer. A single folder appeared. Its name was Promise. Inside were dozens of video files. Suga clicked the first. An old recording appeared. The quality was poor. The camera was positioned inside a rehearsal studio. A younger Suga was sitting alone on the floor. Across from him sat the unidentified person. Their face was still hidden by the camera angle. Jungkook watched silently. "I don't want anyone to know," the person said in the recording. "I know," Suga replied. "But you need help." "I know." "Then let me help." "Only if you promise." "What?" "If I leave, you don't tell them why." Younger Suga hesitated. Then he nodded. "I promise." The video ended. Jimin looked at Suga. That was it. No, Suga opened another file. This one showed the same person standing near the studio door. Their voice was shaking. "If I disappear, don't look for me." Suga's younger voice answered. "I can't promise that." The person laughed softly. "Then promise me something else." "What?" "When the time comes, tell them the truth." The video ended abruptly. Jungkook stared at the screen. "You never told anyone." Suga shook his head. "I thought the promise meant keeping the secret." Jimin looked at the letter. Maybe it meant telling the truth when the person was ready. Suga closed his eyes. Maybe. Then the computer screen suddenly went black. The speakers crackled. A voice came through. Distorted. Almost whispering. "You finally understand." Jungkook.
The door opened slowly, and Suga's entire body tensed when a familiar silhouette appeared beneath the weak hallway light. But instead of stepping inside immediately, the person remained motionless, one hand still resting on the handle as if they had been waiting for permission to enter. Jungkook instinctively moved closer to Jimin, while Jimin placed an arm around his shoulders. Mr. Lee quietly reached for his phone. "Don't!" Suga whispered. Everyone froze. The figure finally stepped into the archive room. It was a senior production coordinator who had been backstage throughout the concert, the same person whose lanyard had appeared in the photograph, and on their right hand was the thin silver ring with the small black stone. Jungkook stared at it, Jimin's breathing caught. Suga said nothing for several seconds. "You," he finally whispered. The coordinator looked at him without fear. Yes. Mr. Lee took one step forward. What are you doing here? The person glanced toward the red box on the table. You found it. Suga's expression hardened. You left it for us. I needed you to find it. Why? The coordinator looked at Jungkook. Because he needed to know that none of this was his fault. Jungkook stared at them. You were the one sending the messages. The person didn't answer immediately. Some of them. Jimin's voice sharpened. There were other messages I didn't send. Suga narrowed his eyes. Then someone else is involved. The coordinator nodded. Yes. Who? I don't know. Answer seemed almost impossible. Suga stepped closer. You've been watching us for months. I have. You recorded Jungkook. Yes. Jungkook's voice trembled. Why? The coordinator looked at him. Because I was trying to understand what was happening to you. Jungkook frowned. You could have asked me. You wouldn't have answered. Jimin interrupted. You don't know that. The coordinator gave a tired smile. I know more than you think. They reached into their jackets slowly. Suga immediately raised his hand. Stop. The person froze. It's only a phone. Put it on the table. They did. Suga approached carefully. The phone contained dozens of files, videos, notes, photographs, messages, but unlike the anonymous notebook, many files were clearly labeled with dates and descriptions. What is all this? Suga asked. Evidence. Evidence of what? That someone has been manipulating Jungkook's environment for months. Jungkook stared at the phone. You knew. I suspected. Then why did you scare me? The coordinator looked genuinely regretful. Because I made the mistake of believing fear would make you pay attention. Jungkook's eyes became wet. It didn't make me stronger. I know. It made me cry. The coordinator lowered their gaze. I know. Jimin stepped forward. Do you understand what you've done? Yes. Then why didn't you stop? Because I was afraid. That answer silenced everyone. Suga studied them carefully. Afraid of what? The coordinator looked at him. The same thing you were afraid of years ago. Suga's expression changed. You knew about the promise. I was there. You were there that night? Yes. The coordinator's voice became quieter. I was the person who helped them leave. Suga stared at them. Why didn't you tell me? Because they asked me not to. You knew where they went, for a while. And now, the coordinator shook their head. No, Jimin looked confused. Then who has been sending the recent messages? The coordinator looked toward the dark monitor. That's what I haven't figured out. Suddenly, the old computer turned on by itself. The screen displayed a live feed of the archive room. Everyone stared at themselves on the monitor. The coordinator stepped backward. No, Suga turned toward them. What? This isn't my system. The screen flickered. A new message appeared. You found the wrong person. Jungkook's face went pale. Another message appeared. The ring was a distraction. Suga's eyes narrowed. Then who are we looking for? The screen changed again. This time it displayed a photograph of the backstage corridor from earlier that night. Jungkook was visible near the dressing rooms. Jimin was walking toward Studio B. Suga was entering the corridor. But there was something else. A figure stood in the background. Someone nobody had noticed before. The figure wasn't wearing a production lanyard. They were dressed in black from head to toe. Their face was hidden, but they were holding something. A folder. The same folder Jimin had remembered from Tuesday night. That's them, Jimin whispered. The coordinator stepped closer. I've never seen that person. Suga stared at the photograph. Neither have I. Jungkook looked at Jimin. You said they were in Studio B. Jimin nodded. Yes. What did they say? Jimin closed his eyes. They said something had happened involving you. What exactly? Jimin struggled to remember. Then his expression changed. They said he doesn't know what he's carrying. Suga immediately looked at Jungkook. What does that mean? Jungkook shook his head. I don't know. The coordinator suddenly spoke. Maybe I do. Everyone looked at them. Jungkook was given something weeks ago. Jungkook frowned. Given what? A recording. What recording? A voice message. Jungkook's face changed. I did receive one. Suga stepped closer. Why didn't you tell us? Jungkook swallowed. Because I thought it was spam. What did it say? Jungkook tried to remember. It was distorted. Someone said, you don't remember what happened before you joined. Jimin's eyes widened. Before you joined? Jungkook nodded. Then the message ended. Suga looked troubled. Did you save it? Maybe. Jungkook pulled out his phone. He searched through old files. After several seconds, he found it. Here. Suga listened. Static filled the room, then a distorted voice spoke. You were told one story. A pause. It wasn't the whole story. Jungkook's face became pale. The recording continued. Ask the person who promised to protect the truth. Then it ended. Suga looked at the floor. The coordinator stared at him. They've been trying to reach you for months. Suga's voice was quiet. Why? Because you're the only person who knows where the original record is. Jungkook looked confused. Original record? Suga's eyes widened. The rehearsal archive. Mr. Lee shook his head. We already searched it. Not the current archive, Suga said. The original one. Jimin frowned. Where? Suga looked toward the old floor map. The basement. Mr. Lee's face changed. That area was sealed years ago. Exactly. Suga turned toward the door. That's where we need to go. The coordinator shook their head. You shouldn't. Suga looked at them. Why? Because that's where they want you. The room fell silent. Jungkook felt his stomach tighten. So we're walking into a trap. Maybe. The coordinator looked at him. Or maybe it's the only place you'll find the truth. Jimin looked at Suga. What do you think? Suga remained silent for a moment. Then he looked at Jungkook. Do you want to know? Jungkook took a deep breath. Yes. Even if the truth hurts. Jungkook nodded. Yes. Suga looked at Jimin. And you? Jimin nodded. Together. Suga turned to Mr. Lee. Can you get us into the basement? Mr. Lee hesitated. I can try. They left the archive and moved through a service corridor rarely used by performers. The walls were unfinished concrete. Pipes ran overhead. The air became colder with every step. Jungkook could hear water dripping somewhere in the darkness. Jimin stayed beside him. Suga walked ahead. The coordinator followed several meters behind. At the end of the corridor was a steel door with an old keypad. Mr. Lee entered an authorization code. The lock clicked. The door opened. A stale smell of dust and old paper drifted outward. They entered. The basement was almost completely dark. Suga turned on his flashlight. Shelves filled the room. Old rehearsal tapes, contracts, photographs, boxes labeled with years. This is everything? Jungkook asked. Almost, Mr. Lee said. Suga walked deeper into the room, then he stopped. On one shelf was a small black recorder. He picked it up. There was a label on it. Tuesday. Jimin's face went pale. That's the rehearsal. Suga pressed play. At first, there was only static, then voices, their voices, from years ago. They were talking about a difficult period, about schedules, pressure, and something that had happened behind closed doors. Then another voice appeared, a voice Jungkook didn't recognize. If he finds out, he'll never forgive you. Suga's face became rigid. The recording continued. You promised. Suga's younger voice answered, I did. Then keep it. The recording ended. Jungkook stared at Suga. Young. Suga didn't move. Jimin whispered, what were you hiding? Suga finally looked at them. I don't know anymore. Then the basement lights suddenly turned on. Every shelf became visible. At the far end of the room stood a person wearing black. No mask, no cap, no ring, just a calm expression. Jungkook recognized the face immediately. His breath stopped. It was someone who had been close to the group for years, someone he trusted, someone who had always seemed harmless. Jimin whispered their name. Suga stepped forward. You! The person smiled sadly. Finally! Jungkook stared in disbelief. Why? The person looked at him. Because you were never supposed to be the one who suffered. Suga's voice became cold. Then why did you make him cry? The person lowered their eyes. Because I needed you to remember. Suga stepped closer. Remember what? The person looked at the old recorder. The promise you made. Then they turned toward Jungkook. And the promise someone else broke. Jungkook felt tears rise again, but this time they weren't caused by fear alone. They were caused by the realization that the person standing before them had been carrying a truth connected to their lives for years. The person took one step forward and whispered, Jungkook, there is something about the beginning of your story that nobody ever told you. Jimin immediately moved closer to him. Suga's eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? The person looked at Suga. Ask him what happened the night before Jungkook entered the company. Suga froze. Jungkook's heart pounded. What happened? Nobody answered. The basement fell silent except for the distant sound of water dripping through an old pipe. And in that silence, Jungkook realized that the mystery was no longer about who had made him cry. It was about why someone had spent years trying to protect a secret connected to the very beginning of his life with them. Before Jungkook entered the company, someone came looking for him, the person in the basement finally said, and Jungkook felt the words strike him with such force that for several seconds he forgot how to breathe. The old basement seemed to shrink around them, the concrete walls absorbing every sound, while Suga stood motionless beside the dusty shelves, his face revealing that he already understood more than he wanted to admit. Jimin immediately stepped closer to Jungkook. What do you mean someone came looking for him? He asked. The stranger looked toward Suga. You know exactly what I mean. Suga's jaw tightened. Don't drag him into something that happened before he even knew us. That's exactly why he deserves to know. Jungkook looked from one face to another. Someone came looking for me, the stranger nodded. Years ago, before the audition, before the training, before any of this. Jungkook's thoughts raced. Who? Someone who believed you were connected to a promise that had nothing to do with you. Suga stepped forward. Enough. The stranger looked at him. You promised to protect the truth, Yoongi. You never promised to keep Jungkook ignorant forever. Jimin stared at Suga. Is that true? Suga closed his eyes. For a moment he seemed to be fighting with himself, then he spoke quietly. I knew there was a connection. Jungkook's voice trembled. A connection between me and what? Suga looked at him. The person I promised to protect once told me about someone they had been trying to find. Jungkook swallowed. Me? Not exactly. Then who? Suga hesitated. Your family. The words made Jungkook go still. Jimin's hand tightened around his shoulder. The stranger continued. Years ago, the person Suga helped was investigating something that happened during a private training program. They discovered records that had been altered. Names disappeared. Dates changed. People who should have been listed were erased. Jungkook frowned. What does that have to do with me? One name kept appearing in the original documents. The stranger looked directly at him. Your family name. Jungkook felt a chill run through him. That's impossible. I wish it were. Suga moved toward the stranger. You don't know the whole story. Neither do you anymore. The stranger's voice remained calm. That's why we're here. Jimin looked at Jungkook. Are you okay? Jungkook nodded automatically, but his hands were trembling. I'm trying to understand. He looked at Suga. Why didn't you tell me? Suga's eyes became wet. Because I was told there was nothing you needed to know. By whom? Suga looked toward the old recorder. By someone who believed the truth would destroy you. Jungkook stared at him. And you believed them? At the time, yes. Why? Suga's voice cracked slightly. Because I was young, and I thought protecting someone meant deciding what they were allowed to know. Jimin lowered his eyes. The irony was painful. Earlier that night, they had talked about protecting Jungkook. Now they were standing in a basement surrounded by secrets that had been hidden for years in the name of protection. I'm not angry because you kept a secret, Jungkook said quietly. I'm angry because everyone keeps deciding what I can handle. Suga looked at him. You're right. The immediate admission surprised Jungkook. Suga continued, I should have trusted you enough to let you choose. The stranger watched them silently. Then they walked toward a metal cabinet at the far end of the basement. The original records are here. Mr. Lee approached cautiously. That cabinet has been locked for years. I know. The stranger pulled a small key from their pocket. Who gave you that? Suga asked. The person who started this. Who? You keep asking the wrong question. Suga's eyes narrowed. Then give me the right one. The stranger looked at Jungkook. Ask why someone wanted him to become a performer. Jungkook frowned. I became a performer because I loved singing. That's what you were told. What are you saying? The stranger inserted the key into the lock. I'm saying there was another reason someone wanted your audition to happen. The cabinet opened with a metallic groan. Inside were folders covered in dust. The stranger pulled out a thin brown file. The cover had no title, only a date. Jungkook stared at it. That's my birth year. Jimin looked at Suga. Suga stepped closer. Give me that. The stranger handed it to him. Suga opened the folder. Inside were documents, photocopies, and a photograph. Jungkook recognized the photograph immediately. It was him as a child. He stared at it in disbelief. Where did you get that? The stranger answered quietly, from the original file. Jungkook took one step forward. Why was my picture there? Suga turned another page. His expression changed. This can't be right. Jimin leaned over his shoulder. What? Suga pointed to a document. This says someone contacted the company before Jungkook auditioned. Jungkook's heart began pounding. Who? The name was partially covered by black ink. It's been redacted, Suga said. The stranger shook their head. Not originally. They reached into the folder and pulled out another sheet. This is the unedited copy. Suga took it. The name was visible. Everyone became silent. It was the name of someone connected to the group who had been present throughout the night. Jungkook stared at it. No, Jimin whispered. That can't be. Suga's face hardened. We need to verify this. The stranger nodded. That's why I brought you here. Suddenly a noise echoed from the upper corridor. Everyone turned. Footsteps. More than one person. Mr. Lee immediately moved toward the stairs. Someone's coming. Suga closed the file. How many? Mr. Lee listened. At least 3. Jimin looked at the stranger. Are they with you? No. Suga turned off the basement lights. Darkness swallowed the room. Jungkook felt Jimin's hand find his. The footsteps grew louder. Someone opened the upper door. Voices drifted down the stairwell. Search every room. Another voice answered, the basement. Especially the basement. Suga leaned toward Jungkook. Stay behind me. Jungkook whispered, who are they? I don't know. The stranger whispered, they're here for the file. Suga's eyes narrowed. How do you know? Because they came looking for it before. The footsteps descended the stairs, one step, then another. The basement remained completely dark. Jungkook could hear his own heartbeat. Jimin squeezed his hand. Breathe, he whispered. Jungkook inhaled slowly. Suga gestured toward a narrow service passage behind the cabinet. Mr. Lee quietly opened it. They moved one by one. The stranger carried the file. Suga stayed at the back. Just as they reached the passage, the basement lights suddenly came on. A voice shouted, there. Suga turned. A shadow rushed toward them. He pushed the door shut. Go! They ran through the narrow passage. Dust filled the air. Pipes rattled overhead. Jungkook stumbled and Jimin caught him. I'm okay. Keep moving. Behind them, the door slammed open. Footsteps followed. Suga looked back briefly. Faster. The passage opened into an old loading area. They emerged behind the building where cold night air struck their faces. Everyone stopped to breathe. Mr. Lee looked toward the building. They didn't follow. Suga stared at the dark windows. Not yet. Jungkook was still holding Jimin's hand. He looked down at it, then back at Suga. Show me the file. Suga hesitated. Not here. Please. Suga finally handed it to him. Jungkook opened the folder. The photograph of him as a child was still there. Beneath it was a handwritten note. Potential candidate, monitor development, contact when appropriate. Jungkook's eyes widened. Potential candidate? Jimin looked at the page. That sounds like you were being watched before you even auditioned. Jungkook shook his head. No. He turned another page. There was an old schedule from the audition period. One date was circled. The date of Jungkook's first audition. Next to it was a note. Proceed if conditions are met. Jimin stared at it. What conditions? Suga found another document. We don't know. The stranger spoke quietly. There is one more page. Jungkook looked at them. Where? Behind the photograph. Jungkook carefully lifted it. A folded sheet was hidden behind the picture. He opened it. The handwriting was different. It was older and more personal. It read, if he ever discovers this, tell him he was never chosen because he was useful. He was chosen because someone believed he deserved a place where his voice could be heard. Jungkook stared at the sentence. His eyes filled with tears. What does that mean? Suga's expression softened. Maybe it means someone genuinely believed in you. Jungkook shook his head. Then why all the secrecy? The stranger looked away. Because another person used that belief for something else. Jimin asked, who? The stranger didn't answer. Instead, they pointed toward the final line. Jungkook read it aloud. Do not let them turn his gift into a weapon. Silence followed. Suddenly, everything Jungkook had experienced that night seemed connected. The anonymous messages, the notebook, the surveillance, the old promise, the warnings. Someone wasn't simply trying to destroy him. Someone was trying to control the story surrounding him. But the question remained, who? Suga looked at the stranger. You said you were helping us. Why didn't you come directly to me? Because I tried. When? 3 months ago. Suga frowned. I never received anything. You did. The stranger reached into their pocket and showed him a photograph of an envelope being placed outside Suga's studio. That was you. Suga stared at it. I thought it was fan mail. It contained the first warning. Suga's expression darkened. Why didn't you follow up? Because someone intercepted it. Jimin looked shocked. Someone inside the building. The stranger nodded. Someone with access to internal communications. Mr. Lee looked toward the building. Then the person we're looking for is still inside. The stranger's eyes met his. Yes. Jungkook felt another wave of fear, but this time something else rose beneath it. Anger, not destructive anger. The kind that came from finally realizing that someone had been making decisions about his life without his knowledge. I want to know who, he said. Suga looked at him. We will. Jungkook shook his head. No, I want to know. Suga understood. He nodded. Then we'll find out together. Jimin smiled faintly. Together. The stranger watched them for a moment, then their expression changed. There's something else. Suga looked at them. What? The person who has been sending the latest messages isn't trying to expose the old secret anymore. Then what are they doing? They're trying to make you distrust each other. Jungkook frowned. Why? The stranger looked directly at him. Because they know something you don't. Suga asked. What? The stranger's voice dropped to a whisper. The original secret isn't about Jungkook's past. They paused. It's about someone in his present. Jimin's face tightened. Who? The stranger looked toward the building. Someone who has been standing beside him every day. Jungkook felt a chill move through his body. Suga's eyes immediately scanned the darkness around them. Are you saying one of us? No, the stranger shook their head. Someone else. Then their phone vibrated. They looked at the screen and went completely pale. Suga noticed. What happened? The stranger slowly turned the phone around. A new message had appeared. You have the file, now bring it to me. Beneath it was a location. The stranger stared at the address. That's impossible. Jimin asked, why? The stranger whispered, because that's where the person we're looking for works. Jungkook looked at Suga. Who? Suga stared at the location, then slowly raised his eyes. The main production office. For the first time, nobody spoke. The building they had just left was no longer simply a concert venue. It had become the center of a mystery that had been growing for years. And somewhere inside that building, someone was waiting for them to bring the truth back into their hands. The main production office was supposed to be empty, but when Suga pushed open the glass door, the faint glow of a desk lamp was still visible inside, and Jungkook immediately felt that familiar pressure return to his chest because someone was sitting behind the desk with their back turned toward them, perfectly still, as if they had been waiting for their arrival all along. Jimin whispered, "We're not alone." Suga raised one hand, signaling everyone to stay behind him. The stranger who had brought them from the basement remained near the entrance. Mr. Lee quietly locked the hallway door. Nobody spoke. Then the person behind the desk slowly turned around. It was the head of production. Jungkook recognized him instantly. He had seen him countless times during rehearsals, always carrying schedules, speaking calmly with staff, checking stage arrangements, and occasionally asking Jungkook whether he had eaten. The man looked at them without surprise. "You found the file," he said. Suga's eyes narrowed. "You knew we would come." The production head leaned back. "Eventually." Jimin stepped closer. "Are you the person behind all of this?" The man shook his head. "No," Jungkook stared at him. "Then why are you here?" "Because I knew the person who is." The room became silent. Suga placed the file on the desk. "Start talking." The man looked at the folder but didn't touch it. "Before I do, you need to understand something." "What?" "The messages were never intended to destroy Jungkook." Jungkook frowned. "Then why did I have to cry?" The man looked at him with visible regret. "Because someone wanted Suga to remember." Suga's expression hardened. "Everyone keeps saying that." "Because it's true." "Then tell me what I forgot." The production head stood and walked toward a locked cabinet. He opened it and removed an old recording device. Years ago, there was a dispute over an internal training program. Several records were altered. One person discovered it. Suga stared at the recorder. "The person I promised to protect." "Yes, what did they discover?" "That someone had been manipulating trainee evaluations." Jimin frowned. "Why?" The man looked at Jungkook. "To control who received opportunities." Jungkook's stomach tightened. "You mean auditions?" "Among other things." Suga's face became grim. "Was Jungkook one of them?" "Not originally." Jungkook looked confused. "Then why was my name in the records?" The man placed the recorder on the desk. "Because someone noticed your talent before you ever entered the building." Jimin stared at him. "Who?" "The person who helped you audition." Jungkook's eyes widened. "But I thought I found the audition myself." The production head shook his head. "That's the story you were given." Jungkook felt as if the floor had shifted beneath him. "So someone arranged it?" "Not exactly. Someone made sure you knew about the opportunity." Suga looked at the old file. "And that person was connected to the secret?" "Yes." "Who?" The production head looked toward the stranger. "They know." Everyone turned. The stranger stepped forward slowly. "It was the person I told you about." Suga stared at them. "They're alive." "Yes, where?" "Close." Jungkook's heart began pounding. "Who are they?" The stranger hesitated. "Someone you have already met." Jimin immediately looked at the production head. "You." The man shook his head. "No." Suga looked at Mr. Lee. "You." Mr. Lee shook his head quickly. "No." Jungkook looked at the stranger. "Then who?" The stranger finally answered. "The person who has been trying to reach you isn't interested in your past. They're trying to stop something that is happening now." Suga frowned. "What?" "Someone is attempting to recreate the same manipulation system." Production head nodded. "We discovered unusual changes in schedules, evaluations, and internal communications months ago." Jimin's expression tightened. "And nobody told us. We didn't have proof." Jungkook looked at the notebook. "But someone did." The stranger nodded. "That's why the notebook exists." Suga stared at it. "Who wrote it?" "The person who disappeared." The room fell silent. Jungkook's eyes widened. "Then they're alive." "Yes." And they've been watching us, trying to protect you. Jimin frowned. Then why use threats? The stranger looked uncomfortable. Because they didn't trust anyone anymore. Suga understood. Including me. The stranger nodded. Especially you. Suga lowered his gaze. The old promise had become a wall between them, a wall built from good intentions, guilt, and fear. I thought I protected them, Suga whispered. You did, the stranger said, but protection became silence. Jungkook looked at Suga. You don't have to carry that anymore. Suga's eyes became wet. I know. The production head reached into another drawer and removed a small envelope. There is one final piece. He handed it to Jungkook. This was left for you. Jungkook stared at his name written across the front. Jimin stood beside him. Open it. Jungkook carefully tore the envelope. Inside was a letter. The handwriting was familiar from the old recordings. He began reading silently. Jungkook, if you're reading this, then Suga finally told you enough to stop protecting me from the truth. I'm sorry that you were dragged into something that began long before you understood any of it. You were never chosen because someone wanted to use you. You were noticed because someone saw what you could become. But there are people who learned how to turn opportunity into control. I tried to stop them. I failed. When I disappeared, I thought the system would disappear with me. It didn't. It simply learned how to hide better. Jungkook's eyes filled with tears. He continued. The person sending you the cruel messages is not the person you should fear most. They are trying, badly and imperfectly, to force the truth into the light. But someone else has been manipulating the information around you. Someone who understands your routines. Someone who knows which words will hurt you. Someone who knows exactly when you are most vulnerable. Jimin looked at Jungkook. That's why they knew about your tears. Jungkook nodded slowly. He continued reading. If they ever make you believe you are a burden, remember this, you were never a burden to the people who loved you. You were simply surrounded by people who were too afraid to tell you what was happening. Jungkook stopped reading. His tears fell onto the paper. Jimin placed a hand on his back. Suga stood silently beside them. The letter continued. And Yoongi, if you are standing there too, I need you to know something. You kept your promise, you just misunderstood what it meant. Protecting someone doesn't always mean keeping their secret. Sometimes it means trusting them with the truth. Suga closed his eyes. One tear slipped down his cheek. Jungkook looked at him. Hyung. Suga wiped it quickly. I'm okay. Jungkook smiled through tears. You don't have to be. Suga looked at him. For a moment neither spoke. Then Suga nodded. You're right. Jimin smiled softly. Progress. Suga almost laughed. Then the production head spoke again. There's one more thing. Everyone looked at him. The person manipulating the current system has already accessed tomorrow's schedule. Suga's expression changed. What did they change? The production head handed him a printed schedule. Several performance times had been altered. One rehearsal had been moved to an isolated studio. Jungkook's name appeared beside it. Suga immediately shook his head. He isn't going alone. We can cancel it, Mr. Lee said. Not yet, Suga replied. If we cancel it, they'll know we found the change. Jimin looked at him. So we go. No, Suga looked at the schedule again. We create a false schedule. The production head understood immediately. We let them think Jungkook is going to the studio. Exactly. Jimin looked concerned. And where does he actually go? Suga looked at Jungkook. Somewhere safe. Jungkook nodded. I'm with you. The plan was simple but risky. They would allow the altered schedule to remain visible while quietly changing the actual movements. Mr. Lee would monitor the access points. The production head would track the internal system. Suga and Jimin would stay with Jungkook. The stranger would search for the original author of the notebook. For the first time, everyone had a clear objective. Yet Suga knew something still didn't fit. The anonymous person had known about his old promise. They had access to private information. They knew when Jungkook was vulnerable, but the person who manipulated the current schedule had different motives. There were two players. One was trying to expose the truth. The other was trying to control the narrative, and they had been accidentally working against each other. We need to know who the second person is, Suga said. The production head nodded. We have one clue. He pulled up an internal access log. Someone has been entering Jungkook's digital schedule using a temporary account. That's the problem. What? The account was created using a name that doesn't exist. Jimin frowned. Then how did they get access? Someone inside created it. Suga looked at the screen. The username was only 4 letters. MIRA. Jungkook stared at it. I've never heard of that account. Mr. Lee shook his head. Neither have I. The stranger suddenly looked uneasy. MIRA, Suga noticed. You know it. The stranger hesitated. I saw that name years ago. Where? In the original training records. Suga stepped closer. What did it mean? The stranger looked at Jungkook. It wasn't a person's name. Everyone waited. It was a designation. For what? The stranger swallowed. A monitoring project. Jungkook's face went pale. Monitoring project? Yes. Suga stared at the screen. Who created it? The stranger whispered. The same people who altered the evaluations. The room went completely silent. Then Jungkook's phone vibrated. Everyone looked at it. A new message appeared. You found MIRA. Another appeared seconds later. Now ask why Jungkook was the first name on the list. Jungkook stared at the screen. His hands began shaking again. Jimin immediately took his hand. Suga looked at the production head. Lock the building. Mr. Lee reached for his radio. What are you planning? Suga looked at Jungkook. We're done reacting. He picked up the file. Now we make them react to us. And for the first time that night, Jungkook wasn't crying because he felt helpless. He was crying because he finally understood that the truth he had feared for so long might not destroy him at all. It might finally explain why he had spent so many years feeling as though someone was always watching from the shadows. The room remained silent after Suga said, Now we make them react to us. Because everyone understood that the moment they had spent the entire night fearing had finally arrived. And Jungkook could feel the weight of every unanswered question pressing against his chest as he stared at the word MIRA glowing on the phone's screen. Jimin kept his hand wrapped around Jungkook's, his thumb moving slowly across his knuckles, while Suga stood in front of them with an expression that was no longer frightened but painfully determined. Nobody leaves this building alone, Suga said. Nobody answers unknown calls. Nobody deletes anything. From this moment forward, we document everything. Mr. Lee nodded and immediately began contacting security while the production head moved toward the central computer system to isolate the suspicious account. The stranger remained near the window, staring into the darkness outside. Jungkook looked at them. You knew about MIRA before tonight. The stranger turned slowly. Yes. Then tell me everything. The stranger hesitated. MIRA wasn't created to target you. Jungkook waited. It was created to predict people. Jimin frowned. Predict them? Their behavior, their stress patterns, their reactions to pressure, the people they trusted, the moments when they were most vulnerable. Jungkook's face tightened. That sounds horrible. It was supposed to be a research project, the production head said, but someone realized that information could be used to manipulate careers. Suga looked toward him, and they turned it into a system. Yes. Jungkook stared at the screen. Why was my name first? The stranger answered softly. Because someone believed you were unusually sensitive to the emotional environment around you. Jungkook almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. So someone studied me because I cared too much. They studied you because they believed that caring made you predictable. Jimin immediately shook his head. They were wrong. Jungkook looked at him. Were they? Jimin's expression softened. You care deeply, that's not the same as being weak. Suga glanced at Jungkook. He's right. Jungkook looked down. Then why did I cry so easily tonight? Suga walked closer. Because you've been carrying fear without understanding where it came from. He paused. Anyone would break under that. Jungkook swallowed hard. When you found me crying beside Jimin, you looked terrified. Suga's eyes lowered. Because I thought the past had finally reached you. Jungkook nodded slowly. And now I think it reached all of us. The words were quiet, but they changed something in the room. For years, Suga had treated the secret as a burden he had to carry alone. Jungkook suddenly understood that his silence had never been caused by indifference. It had been caused by fear. Fear that telling the truth would hurt someone. Fear that opening an old wound would destroy the people he had spent years protecting. But secrecy had created its own wound. Jimin looked at Suga. You don't have to protect us by yourself anymore. Suga gave him a tired smile. I know. Then the computer chimed. Everyone turned. The production head stared at the screen. We have an access attempt. Suga approached. From MIRA? Yes. Can you trace it? It's moving through 3 internal servers. Mr. Lee frowned. Someone is trying to make it look like the account is coming from multiple locations. Suga nodded. They're hiding the real source. The production head began typing rapidly. Lines of information filled the monitor. I have something. What? The account isn't being accessed from outside. Everyone froze. Then where? He enlarged the map. A red dot appeared inside the building. Here. Jungkook stared at the location. His heart stopped for a moment. The dot was near the old rehearsal corridor. That's where we were earlier, Jimin whispered. No, the production head said. Look closer. The red dot moved. It wasn't in the rehearsal corridor anymore, it was moving toward them. Mr. Lee immediately stood. Everyone back. The office door remained closed. No footsteps came, no knock, nothing. Then the lights flickered, once, twice. The computer went black. Jungkook instinctively stepped toward Jimin. Suga raised his phone and turned on the flashlight. Stay together. A soft sound came from the hallway, a door opening, then another. Mr. Lee checked the security feed on his phone. Someone is moving through the corridor. How far? 20 meters. Suga looked at Jungkook. We're going through the emergency exit. They moved quickly. The stranger took the file. Jimin stayed beside Jungkook. Suga was the last one out. They reached the stairwell just as the office door opened behind them. Nobody spoke. They descended 2 floors and entered a smaller conference room used for private meetings. Mr. Lee locked the door. Everyone breathed heavily. Jungkook leaned against the wall. Who was that? We don't know, Suga said, but they know where we are. Jimin looked at the stranger. You said the person behind MIRA was trying to control Jungkook. Yes. Then why haven't they attacked us? The stranger looked at him. Because they don't need to. Jimin frowned. What does that mean? They want you to turn against each other. Jungkook shook his head. That's not going to happen. The stranger looked at him. Are you sure? Jungkook glanced at Suga, then at Jimin. Yes. Suga's expression softened. That's exactly what they didn't expect. The door suddenly clicked. Everyone turned. Mr. Lee approached cautiously and unlocked it. A security officer stood outside holding a small black drive. We found this near the main production office. Suga took it. Where? Inside the ventilation access. Suga examined it. Did you touch it? Only with gloves. Good. They connected it to an isolated computer. A folder appeared. MIRA Final. Jungkook stared at the screen. Open it. Suga looked at him. Are you sure? Yes. The folder contained one video. Suga pressed play. The screen showed an old room. A younger version of the unidentified person from the basement was sitting across from Suga. But this time, another person was present. Their face was partially visible. Jungkook stared at the screen. That's, Jimin whispered his name. The person was someone who had worked around the organization for years but had never been suspected of anything. Someone who had recently been responsible for digital scheduling. Someone who had access to internal systems. The production head's face went pale. It can't be. The video continued. The person spoke calmly. The project isn't about controlling them. It's about predicting when they will break. Younger Suga slammed his hand on the table. You can't do this. Why not? Because they're people. People are patterns. No, Suga's younger voice shook with anger. They're not data. The video ended. Jungkook stared at the blank screen. They've been watching us all this time. The stranger nodded. Yes. Suga closed his eyes. I should have seen it. Jungkook looked at him. You couldn't. I should have. No. Jungkook stepped closer. You were trying to protect someone. Suga looked at him. And you were trying to protect me. Jungkook nodded. Maybe that's why we both made the same mistake. Jimin smiled faintly, thinking we had to carry everything alone. Suga laughed softly through the tension. Apparently we're all terrible at asking for help. Jungkook smiled through tears. Maybe we can learn. The production head immediately contacted security and legal personnel. Within minutes, the building's access systems were locked down. The person responsible for the MIRA account was identified and escorted from the premises for questioning. The old records were secured. The notebook, photographs, recordings, and digital files were copied and preserved. But the most important thing happened quietly. Nobody tried to hide the truth from Jungkook anymore. Suga sat beside him in the empty conference room. Jimin sat on Jungkook's other side. The fluorescent lights above them hummed softly. Outside, rain began tapping against the windows. Suga looked at Jungkook. I'm sorry. Jungkook lowered his head. For what? For thinking I had to decide what you could handle. Jungkook looked at him. I forgive you. Suga blinked. That quickly, Jungkook smiled. You cried too. Suga immediately looked away. I didn't cry. Jimin laughed quietly. We all saw it. Suga shook his head. No evidence. Jungkook laughed. It was a small laugh, but after everything that had happened, it felt enormous. Jimin leaned against Jungkook's shoulder. You know what I remember most about tonight? Jungkook asked. What? When Suga walked in and saw me crying. Suga looked at him. Jungkook smiled. Everyone expected him to panic. Jimin nodded. He did. A little, Suga sighed. A lot. Jungkook's smile widened. But then he sat beside me. Suga looked down. Because sometimes there isn't anything clever to say. You didn't need to say anything. Jungkook's voice softened. You just stayed. Jimin looked at Suga. That's what mattered. Suga nodded slowly. Then maybe that's what we should have done from the beginning. The room fell quiet. The storm outside grew louder. Jungkook looked through the window at the wet city lights. For years, he had believed that strength meant hiding fear, smiling when exhausted, continuing when his heart wanted to stop. But that night taught him something different. Strength could also mean admitting that you were afraid. It could mean reaching for someone's hand. It could mean letting people see the parts of you that you usually hid. And perhaps most importantly, it could mean trusting people enough to tell them the truth. The next morning, the backstage corridors were bright again. Staff members moved around with coffee cups and schedules. Equipment rolled across the floor. The ordinary rhythm of work had returned. But something had changed. Jungkook walked into the rehearsal room with Jimin beside him. Suga followed behind them. Nobody knew exactly how many consequences the truth would bring. There would be investigations, difficult conversations, and old wounds that might take years to heal. But the fear that had haunted Jungkook no longer felt invisible. It had a name. It had a history. And now it had been brought into the light. During rehearsal, Jungkook made a mistake in the choreography and stopped. For a second, his old instinct returned. Apologize, blame himself, hide the frustration. But before he could speak, Jimin smiled. Again, Jungkook smiled back. Again. Suga stood near the sound console and watched them. He shook his head with a quiet smile. That's better. The music started again. Their footsteps moved together across the floor. Outside the studio, sunlight spilled through the hallway windows. The same kind of light that had once seemed too bright after a sleepless night now felt strangely comforting. When rehearsal ended, Jungkook walked toward Suga. Hyung. Thank you. Suga looked at him. For what? For coming in that night. Suga smiled. I was supposed to. Jungkook shook his head. No, I mean for staying. Suga understood. He placed a hand briefly on Jungkook's shoulder. Always. Jimin watched them from a few steps away and smiled. There was no dramatic announcement, no perfect ending, and no guarantee that life would suddenly become easy. But there was something better. There was trust. The mystery had begun with Jungkook crying in the darkness beside Jimin, and Suga entering the room to find a scene that had frightened everyone into silence. It ended not with another secret, but with 3 people finally refusing to carry their fears alone. Jungkook had once believed his tears were evidence that something was wrong with him. Now he understood they were simply proof that he had been carrying too much for too long. Suga had believed silence was the purest form of protection. Now he understood that sometimes love required honesty. And Jimin, who had stayed beside Jungkook when words failed, understood that sometimes the most powerful thing a person could do was simply refuse to leave. As the final notes of rehearsal faded into the quiet studio, Jungkook looked at the 2 people beside him and smiled. For the first time in a long time, there was no shadow behind him, no hidden camera, no anonymous message waiting on his phone, and no secret he was forbidden to understand. There was only the music, the familiar voices, and the quiet certainty that whatever came next, he would not face it alone. The rain had stopped by the time Jungkook returned to the backstage corridor that evening, but the polished floor still reflected the pale ceiling lights like a long silver river. And for the first time in days, he walked without constantly looking over his shoulder. Jimin was beside him, humming quietly under his breath, while Suga followed a few steps behind, carrying 3 paper cups of warm tea because, as he had said earlier, nobody is allowed to pretend they're fine without drinking something first. Jungkook smiled when he heard him. Hyung, that's not how emotions work. I know, Suga replied. I'm trying anyway. Jimin laughed. That's very Suga. They reached the small backstage room where everything had begun, the same mirror, the same couch, the same dim lamp. Jungkook stopped at the doorway. For a moment, the memory returned with painful clarity, himself sitting on the floor, tears running down his face, Jimin beside him, and Suga suddenly entering and freezing at the sight. It felt like another lifetime, even though only a short time had passed. You okay? Jimin asked. Jungkook nodded. Yeah, he stepped inside. Actually, I think I am. Suga placed the tea on the table. Good, Jungkook looked at him. You know, when you first walked in, I thought you were angry. Suga raised an eyebrow. I was terrified. You looked angry. That's my face. Jimin laughed so loudly that Jungkook nearly spilled his tea. Exactly, Suga sighed. I hate both of you. No, you don't, Jungkook said. Suga looked at him for a long moment. No, I don't. The words were simple, almost casual, but Jungkook felt their weight. He sat down on the couch. Jimin sat beside him. Suga remained standing for a moment before finally taking the chair opposite them. Nobody spoke. There was no need. For the first time, silence didn't feel threatening. It felt safe. Then Jungkook noticed something on the table, a small black notebook. His expression changed. Where did that come from? Suga looked at it. That wasn't there earlier. Jimin immediately became alert. Suga reached for it but stopped before touching it. Mr. Lee! The door opened almost instantly. Yes, Suga pointed toward the notebook. Did anyone enter this room? Mr. Lee checked his phone. No, security says nobody entered after we left. Jungkook stared at the notebook. Then how did it get here? Nobody answered. Suga carefully photographed it before picking it up. Unlike the first notebook, this one had no silver ring on the cover. Instead, there was a tiny handwritten word. After. Jimin looked at it. After what? Suga opened the first page. It contained only one sentence. When the tears stop, the truth begins. Jungkook felt a chill move through him. Is this another threat? Suga shook his head. I don't think so. He turned the page. This time there was a photograph. It showed the three of them sitting in the conference room earlier that day. The photograph had been taken through the glass from the hallway. Jungkook stared at it. Someone was still watching. Suga's jaw tightened. Maybe. Jimin looked closely. Wait. He pointed toward the edge of the photograph. Look at the reflection. Suga leaned closer. In the glass behind them, a faint silhouette could be seen. But this time there was no black clothing, no silver ring, no hidden face. It was simply a person standing at a distance, watching quietly. Jungkook looked at the hallway outside. Empty. Could they still be here? Mr. Lee checked the cameras. No movement. Suga studied the photograph again. Maybe the person wanted us to see this. Jungkook frowned. Why? Suga turned another page. The answer was written there. Because you deserve to know who stayed. Jimin looked confused. Who stayed? The next page contained a list of names. Some were crossed out. Others were highlighted. Jungkook recognized most of them as former staff members, former trainees, people who had moved on years ago. Then he saw one name that wasn't crossed out. His breathing stopped. That's... Jimin looked at him. Who? Jungkook pointed to the name. The person who helped me find the audition. Suga stared at the page. That's impossible. Why? Because that person left years ago. Jungkook looked at the notebook. Then why are they listed here? Suga turned the page. A recent date had been written beside the name. Yesterday. Jimin's expression became serious. They're still here. Mr. Lee immediately checked the internal records. There's no active employee under that name. Suga looked at him. Check contractors. A minute later, Mr. Lee's face changed. I found something. What? A temporary access badge was issued 3 months ago. Jungkook felt his heart begin to race. To whom? Mr. Lee read the information carefully. The name is different. Suga stepped closer. What's the badge ID? Mr. Lee told him. Suga immediately recognized it. That's the badge used by the person who delivered equipment to Studio B. Jimin's eyes widened. The same studio where Jungkook received the first message. Suga nodded. Yes. The pieces were forming again, but this time they weren't leading toward another mystery. They were leading toward a person, a real person, someone who had been moving through their environment unnoticed. Mr. Lee pulled up the access footage. They watched the screen. A person entered the building 3 months earlier wearing a maintenance uniform. Their face was partly hidden beneath a cap. They moved through the hallway, stopped near the production office, and looked directly into the camera. Then they smiled. Jungkook's stomach tightened. They knew the camera was there. Suga nodded. They wanted us to see them eventually. The footage continued. The person entered Studio B several minutes later. Jungkook appeared on another camera. Then the person exited carrying a small black bag. Jimin whispered, "That's when the messages started." Suga looked at Jungkook. "We finally have a timeline." But Jungkook wasn't looking at the screen anymore. He was looking at the notebook. There's something else. He turned to the final page. A sentence had been written in a different handwriting. "You don't need to find me." Beneath it was another sentence. "You already know where I am." Jungkook stared at the words. What does that mean? Suga looked at the notebook. Then slowly his eyes moved toward the mirror. The room became silent. What? Jimin asked. Suga stood. The person who wrote this knew we'd return here. Jungkook looked around. Why this room? Suga pointed toward the mirror. Because this is where everything began. Mr. Lee inspected the mirror. It appeared ordinary. He tapped the glass. Nothing. He checked the frame. Still nothing. Then Jimin noticed a tiny scratch beneath the lower corner. There. Mr. Lee removed the frame carefully. Behind the mirror was a small compartment. Inside was a photograph and a folded piece of paper. Jungkook stepped forward. The photograph! Suga took it. It showed the three of them years earlier during a rehearsal. They were laughing. Jungkook was holding a microphone. Jimin was leaning against him. Suga stood behind them with an annoyed expression. Jungkook smiled despite himself. We looked so young. Jimin nodded. We were. Suga turned the photograph over. On the back was a handwritten sentence. This is what they wanted to destroy. Jungkook looked at him. What? Suga read the next line. Not your career, not your reputation, your trust. Jimin's expression changed. The entire mystery suddenly made sense. The surveillance wasn't only about information. The messages weren't only about fear. Every photograph, every distorted recording, every half-truth had been designed to make them question each other. To make Jungkook wonder whether Suga had hidden something unforgivable. To make Jimin wonder whether he was somehow responsible. To make Suga believe his old promise had caused everything. The real weapon had never been the secret. It had been doubt. Jungkook sat down slowly. They wanted us to stop trusting each other. Suga nodded. Yes, Jimin looked at him. But why? The answer came from the folded paper. Jungkook opened it. Because people who trust each other are difficult to control. Nobody spoke. Then Jungkook looked at Suga. They failed. Suga smiled faintly. Completely. Jimin leaned against Jungkook's shoulder. Maybe not completely. Jungkook looked at him. What do you mean? Jimin pointed toward the photograph. They made us realize how much we actually trust each other. Jungkook smiled. Suga shook his head. That's annoyingly optimistic. Thank you. It wasn't a compliment. They laughed. The tension finally broke, but before anyone could speak again, the door opened. Mr. Lee entered carrying a tablet. We found the person. Everyone became silent. Suga stood. Where? Outside. Outside where? Mr. Lee looked toward the hallway. They've been waiting near the service entrance for 20 minutes. Jungkook's heart began beating faster. Are they alone? Yes. Suga looked at Jimin, then Jungkook. We don't go out there blindly. Mr. Lee nodded. Security is ready. They walked toward the service entrance together. The corridor was quiet. Their footsteps echoed against the walls. When they reached the door, Suga stopped. He looked at Jungkook. Whatever happens, you don't owe this person forgiveness. Jungkook nodded. I know, Jimin added softly, and you don't owe anyone your fear. Jungkook smiled. I know that too. Suga opened the door. Cold night air rushed inside. Under the yellow light outside stood a person with their hands in their coat pockets. They looked older than Jungkook remembered. Tired, human, not a monster, not a shadow, just a person carrying years of regret. When they saw Jungkook, their eyes immediately filled with tears. I'm sorry, they whispered. Jungkook stopped. The person looked at Suga. I should have come sooner. Suga stared at them. Why didn't you? Because I was afraid you'd hate me. Suga's expression softened. I was angry. I know, but I never hated you. The person lowered their head. You should have. No, Suga stepped closer. You made mistakes, so did I. Jungkook looked at them. Why did you involve me? The person swallowed. Because I thought you were the only person who could break the cycle. What cycle? The belief that protecting people means controlling what they know. Jungkook's eyes filled with tears. You could have told me. I know, you could have trusted me. I know. Instead, you watched me cry. The person's face crumbled. That is the part I regret most. Jimin stepped forward. Then why did you keep going? The person looked at him. Because every time I tried to tell the truth, someone stopped me. Suga asked, who? The person looked back toward the building. The people who created MIRA. They're gone, Mr. Lee said. The system is shut down. MIRA is shut down, the person replied. But the people who built it aren't. Suga's expression hardened. Where are they? The person looked at Jungkook. Somewhere closer than you think. Jungkook felt the old fear return, but this time he didn't step backward. He stood beside Jimin. Suga stood beside him. The person watched them and gave a sad smile. That's why I wanted you to understand something before I disappeared again. Jungkook frowned. Disappear? I'm leaving tonight. Why? Because if I stay, they'll keep using me to reach you. Suga shook his head. You don't have to run anymore. The person looked at him. Neither do you. Suga understood. They were both tired of carrying the past. Jungkook stepped forward. Then don't run. The person stared at him. What? Stay. Their eyes filled with tears. Jungkook continued. You don't have to fix everything tonight. You don't have to protect me. Just tell the truth. The person slowly nodded. Okay. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then they handed Suga a small envelope. This is the last thing. Suga opened it carefully. Inside was a single page containing a list of names, dates, and decisions connected to the old project. At the bottom was one final sentence. The person who started MIRA is not the person you think. Suga looked up. Who is it? The person shook their head. I don't know. Jungkook laughed softly. Of course. Jimin smiled. There's always one more mystery. Suga folded the paper. Then we'll deal with it tomorrow. Jungkook looked at him. Tomorrow? Yes, Suga smiled. Tonight we sleep. Jimin nodded enthusiastically. Finally, someone sensible. Jungkook laughed. They walked back inside together. The hallway was bright. Staff members were beginning to clean up after the day's rehearsals. Someone played music softly from a distant room. The world had not changed completely. The past had not disappeared. There were still questions waiting for answers, but the most important thing had changed. Jungkook no longer felt alone inside his own story. Later that night, he returned to the same backstage room where Suga had first found him crying. He sat on the couch and looked at the mirror. His reflection looked tired but calmer. Jimin entered carrying 2 bottles of water. You still awake? Yeah. Jimin sat beside him, thinking, a little. About everything, Jungkook smiled. Mostly about that night. The night Suga found you. Yeah, Jimin looked toward the doorway. He really looked terrified. Jungkook laughed. He'll deny it forever. Absolutely. They sat quietly. Then Jungkook whispered, thank you. Jimin looked at him. For what? For staying beside me. Jimin smiled. Where else would I be? Jungkook looked down. I don't know. Jimin gently nudged his shoulder. Then remember this, you don't have to know everything tonight. You don't have to solve everything tonight. You just have to remember that you're not alone. Jungkook nodded. Tears appeared in his eyes, but this time he smiled when they fell. The door opened. Suga stood there holding 3 cups of tea. I knew you two would still be awake. Jungkook laughed. You're predictable. And you're dramatic. Jimin smiled. We're all dramatic. Suga handed them the cups, then he looked at Jungkook. You okay? Jungkook nodded. Yeah, Suga smiled. Good. He sat beside them. The 3 remained there beneath the soft backstage light, saying almost nothing. No cameras, no threats, no hidden messages. Just 3 people sharing a quiet moment after surviving a night that had changed the way they understood one another. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the glass. Somewhere far away, traffic moved through the streets. Inside the room, Jungkook finally closed his eyes without fear. The tears that had once terrified everyone were now simply tears. They didn't mean weakness. They didn't mean failure. They meant he was human. And when Suga looked at him that night, he no longer saw someone who needed to be protected from the truth. He saw someone strong enough to face it. Jimin saw the same thing. Jungkook finally saw it too. The mystery might continue. The old project might leave unanswered questions. Someone might still be searching for the documents they had uncovered. But whatever came next, the 3 of them would face it differently. Together. And when the room finally fell silent, Suga glanced at Jungkook one last time and quietly said, If you ever cry again, don't hide. Jungkook smiled. What if I can't stop? Suga leaned back. Then we'll stay until you can. Jimin nodded. Always. Jungkook looked at them both, his eyes shining beneath the warm light, and for the first time since the entire nightmare began, he believed them completely.
The next morning arrived quietly, with pale sunlight slipping through the curtains of the backstage lounge and painting thin golden lines across the floor. But before Jungkook could fully wake from the short sleep he had managed to get, his phone vibrated once on the table, and when he opened his eyes, he saw a message that made every trace of warmth disappear from his face. You found the truth, but you never asked who wrote the first file. Jungkook sat upright, breathing slowly as he read it again, and for a moment the old fear returned, sharp and familiar, but then he remembered Suga's words from the night before and refused to face it alone. He walked directly into the hallway, found Jimin drinking coffee near the rehearsal room, and showed him the message without saying a word. Jimin's expression changed, but instead of panicking, he simply nodded. Let's find Suga. They found him in the production office reviewing the documents they had recovered, and when Jungkook placed the phone on the table, Suga stared at the message for several seconds before calmly taking a breath. Okay, he said. Then we ask. The person who had returned the previous night was brought into the room, along with Mr. Lee and the production head. And for the first time, everyone sat around the same table without hiding anything. Suga placed the original file in the center. Who wrote the first document? The former staff member looked at it and closed their eyes. I don't know. Jungkook's shoulders dropped slightly. Then who does? The person who created the original monitoring system. Suga looked at the production head. You said that person was gone. I said I couldn't find them. That's different. The room became silent. The stranger slowly reached into their bag and removed an old photograph. I found this after I left. Suga took it. The photograph showed a small office from years earlier. Several people stood around a table covered in papers. One face had been circled in red. Jungkook leaned forward. Who is that? Suga stared at the face, and something in his expression changed so quickly that Jimin noticed immediately. You know them? Suga didn't answer. Young, Jungkook said softly. Suga finally spoke. They were never officially part of our team. Then how did they have access? Because they were an external consultant. The production had looked stunned. That person left the organization years ago. Suga nodded. Apparently not completely. Mr. Lee checked the old records. There's no current access badge. Then they don't need one, Suga said. They may have someone working for them. Jungkook stared at the photograph. So this still isn't over. Suga looked at him. No, Jungkook took a breath. Then what do we do? Suga folded the photograph and placed it back on the table. We stop chasing shadows and start protecting the truth. The words didn't sound dramatic. They sounded final. The group contacted the appropriate authorities within the organization, secured the remaining records, and created verified copies of everything they had discovered. No more secret investigations. No more dangerous confrontations in empty rooms. The truth would be handled properly, with evidence instead of fear. As the hours passed, the atmosphere slowly changed. Staff members who had been frightened by rumors began returning to their work. The rehearsal schedule was restored. The suspicious accounts were disabled. The people connected to the old project were identified for further investigation. And most importantly, Jungkook was finally allowed to make his own decisions about what he wanted to know and what he wanted to leave in the past. Later that afternoon, he stood alone in the rehearsal studio, staring at his reflection in the mirror. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and warm electronics. He raised his hand and touched the glass. For weeks, he had looked at his reflection and wondered whether there was something wrong with him. Whether his emotions made him vulnerable, whether his tears had somehow invited the chaos into his life. Now he understood that none of those things were true. He hadn't been weak. He had been overwhelmed. He hadn't been difficult. He had been afraid. And he hadn't needed someone to control his life in order to protect him. He had needed people willing to stand beside him while he faced it. Jimin entered quietly. You disappeared. Jungkook smiled. I needed a minute. Jimin stood beside him. Thinking about everything? Yeah. Do you regret finding out? Jungkook thought for a moment. No, even though it hurt? Especially because it hurt. Jimin looked at him. Jungkook continued. If I never knew, I would always wonder why I felt like something was missing. Jimin nodded. And now? Jungkook looked at their reflections. Now I know I don't have to fill every missing piece. Jimin smiled. That's probably the healthiest thing you've said all week. Jungkook laughed. Don't get used to it. The studio door opened again. Suga entered carrying his familiar cup of tea. Jungkook immediately laughed. Again. Suga looked offended. Hydration. That's tea. Tea contains water. Jimin shook his head. He's impossible. Suga sat on the floor beside them. For several seconds, the three simply looked at the empty studio. Then Suga spoke. I spent years believing that if I kept enough secrets, nobody would get hurt. Jungkook listened. But secrets don't disappear. They wait. Jimin nodded. And sometimes they grow. Suga looked at Jungkook. I'm sorry you had to learn that this way. Jungkook smiled. You stayed. Suga looked down. That's not enough. It was enough for me. Suga's eyes became wet. He quickly looked away. Jimin smiled softly. You're doing it again. Doing what? Almost crying. Suga sighed. Nobody saw anything. Jungkook laughed. We saw everything. Suga shook his head. But this time he didn't hide the smile. Then Jungkook leaned forward and hugged him. Suga froze for half a second before returning the embrace. Jimin joined them, and for a few seconds the three remained there in the quiet studio, laughing softly through tears that no longer felt embarrassing. There was no audience, no camera, no dramatic music. Just three people who had learned something difficult about trust. When they finally separated, Suga looked at Jungkook and said, "If something scares you again, tell us." Jungkook nodded. "I will. Even if it's something small. I will. Even if you think we're busy. I will." Jimin smiled. "And if you don't?" Jungkook looked at him. "You'll notice." Exactly. The rehearsal began later that evening. The music filled the room, and the familiar rhythm returned. Jungkook danced with the same intensity he always had, but there was something different in his movements now. He wasn't performing to prove that he could survive. He was performing because he wanted to. When the final note ended, everyone applauded. Jungkook bent forward, breathing heavily, then looked toward the side of the stage where Suga and Jimin stood. They were smiling. The image reminded him of that terrible night when Suga had entered the backstage room and found him crying beside Jimin. Back then, he had thought the moment represented the collapse of everything. Now he understood it had actually been the beginning of something else. It had been the moment when people who loved him finally realized how much he had been carrying. It had been the moment when Suga's fear broke through his silence. It had been the moment when Jimin refused to leave. And it had been the moment when Jungkook finally allowed himself to be seen. After rehearsal, the backstage corridor filled with familiar sounds again. Staff members laughed. Equipment rolled across the floor. Someone called for a missing microphone. The ordinary chaos of their lives had returned. Jungkook walked toward the same small room where everything had started. He opened the door and found Suga and Jimin already there. "You two planned this?" he asked. Suga shook his head. "No, he means Mail. Maybe the room did." Jungkook laughed and sat down. For a while they talked about completely ordinary things. Food, music, rehearsal mistakes, someone's terrible joke. Nothing important, nothing mysterious. And that was exactly what made the moment beautiful. They didn't need another crisis to bring them together. They could simply exist beside one another. Before leaving, Jungkook looked at the mirror one final time. The reflection staring back at him was still tired, still imperfect, still emotional, but no longer afraid of itself. Suga stood behind him. "Ready?" Jungkook nodded. "Yeah." Jimin opened the door. "Then let's go." Jungkook followed them into the hallway. The door closed behind him. The small room became quiet again, but this time there was no darkness waiting inside. There was only the faint warmth of the lamp and the memory of three people who had learned that sometimes the strongest form of love was not fixing someone's pain, not hiding the truth, and not pretending everything was okay. Sometimes it was simply walking into the room, sitting beside someone who was crying, and saying, "I'm here." And that was what Suga had done. That was what Jimin had done. And eventually, that was what Jungkook learned to do for himself. The mystery